So the US Federal Reserve has cut the interest rate this week in the US, and we're expected to see an interest rate cut by the Bank of England next week. But what does this mean for mortgages and borrowing and property portfolios? Does it mean what you think it would? Should you be sitting there and waiting for rates to go down before you do anything? No. And if you stay watching, I'll tell you why.
And we'll also be talking about how you make sure your properties are ready for the cold of the winter. And we have our person of the week. Welcome to Mortar and Margins. So Adam, we've been a busy week for certainly economists, but also property owners, because we had the US interest rates decision. The Federal Reserve decided to cut rates, which Donald Trump's been telling them they should do for a long, long time. Not as much as he thinks they should cut rates, but they cut from 3.75 to 3.5% their benchmark interest rate. What does that mean for UK property owners?
Well, first of all, we're tied heavily to the US bond market. So when they cut, we cut effectively because we're dragged down or dragged up, depending on what's going on. We've also got the decision coming from the Monetary Policy Committee next week. And we had some mixed messages from the committee who were in front of the Treasury Select Committee, which is always interesting watching if you're needing to sleep late at night on YouTube, Dunk.
Yeah, and for the Bank of England, obviously, with the US having cut, it makes it a little bit easier for them because they don't need to worry about creating disparities in the currency markets. So it's a little bit simpler for them to cut. And I guess that's what you're expecting next week. But what do you think further out, Adam? Where are you seeing the path?
Yeah, I think we've got 2 to 3 cuts coming over the next 12 months. Lean on 3 at the moment, to be honest. And that was also helped in a way by poor UK GDP growth figures or lack thereof. So, we've had our first quarter where we've actually contracted in economic activity. Normally, ceteris paribus, as we economists say, all else being equal, that would mean an extra cut in the rates or a cut more quickly in order to try and boost economic activity, which is obviously a bit wan at the moment, Dunk.
Yeah, so that was a surprise, wasn't it, that drop? And the figures have been, much poorer in the same way the start of the year was much better than expected. The end of the year has been much more disappointing. And obviously there was the cyber attack, but also seems a lack of confidence in the market, which I think will be more worrying for the Bank of England unless they put it down to a sort of temporary budget jitters, I suppose, caused by some perhaps poor communication from the government around what they wanted to do. But so you think there's 3 cuts coming up through next year, but at the beginning you suggested that you maybe felt they wouldn't be feeding through directly into mortgage rates, which is obviously what we care about on this show.
Yeah, so this is where we need to be really careful. I advocate and personally use 5-year fixed rate mortgages because they take out volatility. 2-year fixed rates are for speculators, really. And they've also got a lot of fixed costs these days, valuations, solicitors. It all gets more and more expensive as professional services escalate. But ultimately, the 5-year is only dictated by a relatively small amount by the bank base rate. So we need to be cautious. We also need to be cautious because the price of money is set by the swaps market as a rule, which is related to the gilts market, which is related to the bank base rate, but they're not exactly the same thing. And for the past 2 years or so, the swaps market has been trading at a reasonable discount, about 35 basis points to the 5-year gilt. Now, this is really a measure of supply and demand and confidence in the marketplace. So it's had to be the case that the swaps have had to be discounted because there's been a lack of mortgage demand. If that mortgage demand picks up, that discount can easily, that gap will narrow and potentially become a premium and not a discount. So that 35 basis points, it's a third of a percent. That could quite easily become a premium. That could all be swallowed up by a 0.5% cut in the rates. We wouldn't see anything feed through into the 5-year mortgage rate. So I don't think if we see 3 cuts of 0.25%, which is what I think we probably will see over the next 12 months, then I don't think we're going to see 0.75% come off those 5-year mortgages. I think we might see 0.25% come off the 5-year mortgages, which probably isn't worth hanging out for.
Okay, so what you're saying in effect is that as the Bank of England's benchmark rate drops, that makes mortgage borrowing more attractive, so more people want mortgages, and that effectively actually pushes up the cost of the swap rate, which is effectively the price that the mortgages are, or the 5-year fixed mortgages are based on. And therefore, you think that if you're thinking about remortgaging, you should be thinking about doing it now rather than waiting, because you might not have much of an advantage in a year's time.
There's very little point thinking that you're going to get a lot better deal, and especially if you're sitting there on a variable rate at the moment. There'll be tons of people next year who were on 5-year fixes from 2021, super cheap money, the cheapest money ever got, and they might be sitting thinking, "Well, we'll ride 6 months." You're not alone, Duncan. You're not alone. It's both of us, right? So I don't think there'll be a material improvement. Now, luckily, on our residential properties, we don't pay any sort of premium above the swap. In the buy-to-let arena, we pay loosely a 1.5% to 2% premium above the swap rate. But that's fair enough. We're commercial, and residential is a very competitive space. And you're seeing mortgage war as a big headline pop up again and again at the moment in the press.
And is it still a competitive market? Because we have in the past seen periods where it's been very, very aggressive, banks and lenders trying to win share. Is that something we can expect as rates go down, or are they going to be more cautious and perhaps we won't see such kind of sort of loss leading almost products coming out?
Well, I think what would really change that, any of these sort of seismic shifts, a bit like Reform have mentioned, perhaps not paying any interest on what the commercial banks have got deposited at the Bank of England, a seismic change would change something like that. But this is, they want your mortgage because they want your bank account, because they want all your financial products, particularly your credit card, because that's the one they make money on. And also around about 30% of people don't refix, not just because of apathy, but because circumstances change and things like that. And that's when you get profitable. So you or I won't be profitable to the bank unless we're out of contract, out of term, in which case they'll be making a nice juicy premium on us. Or they might be cross-selling us all their other products, right?
So it's generally the guys who aren't paying enough attention who are the ones that are making money for the banks. And the guys who are really on the ball can try and make sure that they give as little as possible, right?
Yeah, a good way of looking at that would be to look at, say, credit card 0% debt. I mean, it's widely used. Martin Lewis, money saving expert, has preached about this for decades now, really. Around about 50% of the credit card debt in the UK, unsecured debt, obviously, is at 0% interest. So the bank is actually paying you to hold that money. The other half is at about 25% average APR. So credit card debt returns to the banks about 12.5%, which is a good rate of return, of course.
There's a big gap. Right, Adam, I think it's time to move on. And I see behind you, Adam, you've got some blankets piled up. Is it cold in your house at this time of year?
Well, we need to watch as the temperature drops and think about our energy performance certificates and our efficiency on that front, especially with the price of utilities, even though, of course, we're all going to get £150 discount, supposedly, next April per property, Duncan. But yes, that's a reference to energy performance measures and just preparing your portfolio for winter. And a little reminder that we saw in the budget the removal of the Eco4 scheme, the energy company obligation, something that we've used across our portfolio substantially in order to get grant-funded improvements to bring energy performance up to a C or above. We're still waiting for any announcements about primary legislation. We're lost at sea in the market, to be honest, Duncan. And really, we need a new grant scheme announcement before we see whether they're really going to try and push through this 2030 EPCC measure. So it's a very quick breakdown. Currently, you can't let anything under the minimum energy efficiency standards if it's below an E on the EPC rating. Some people, what they've done in Scotland very sensibly is step up towards a D to then get to a C. In England, they're talking about just moving straight to a C and then to a B in the longer run. And the move from C to B would be utterly seismic. There's no feasible way to do that. I don't really believe that will happen. But going from E to C will be quite disruptive. 74% of what's in the PRS does not qualify at the moment on that basis, although it is improving slowly.
And just in your portfolio, Adam, do you know what sort of percentage you have that would make a C grade?
So so the vast majority can make a C grade, but now over 50% of ours makes a C grade. In fact, over 70% of ours. Thanks. We've been quite proactive on these schemes, not knowing how long they would last, of course, and not wanting to look a gift horse in the mouth. But we have quite a lot of low value stock, and the government, or the previous government, correctly recognised that if you've got a house that's worth 50k and you're told energy performance measures, and housing associations are saying things like 36k is the average retrofit spend on a property to get it to EPCC. If the bricks value is 50, you're not going to spend 36 because it's not going to make it worth 86. It's going to make it worth about 51. So there's no return on investment. It's not a feasible business case. So they supported it with grant funding. And it needs to be supported because the single very much largest contributor to carbon emissions is leaky property in the UK.
Right, okay. And so what are the easiest measures that landlords should be taking or could be taking to improve their performance in that regard?
So heat pumps have been a big deal. They're absolutely not suitable for every property. You have to start with insulation and what the EPC people call the heat loss perimeter. Now, this doesn't mean we had a property this week where the tenant had mentioned about build-up, condensation, a little bit of mould appearing. Upon investigation, they had taped shut all of the windows with masking tape because they were concerned about drafts and things like that. But people don't realise if the house can't breathe, then that is what will create the temperature differential between inside and outside. So there's a huge educational piece, not just for tenants, but for all property owners. You know, the PRS looks loosely like the owner-occupier sector as far as the percentage of stock that is EPC C or above. Not that C is necessarily the holy grail.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think we'd definitely come on to that in a future episode, Adam, about how you communicate with tenants, because I think that's a great topic, and that's something landlords have not been that good at, right? Having good communication patterns. But I think we'll probably leave that for another time. So for now, you're saying that if you're a landlord, look at what you can do, what you can get grant funding for right now, because you might not have it very long. Think particularly about insulation and then potentially about heat pumps if it's suitable for the property. And what kind of properties are suitable for heat pumps?
Well, detached, very much so. Anything not on the gas grid, complete no-brainer. But actually, they can fit in terraces as well, generally speaking. So they need some room for it to exhaust in the rear garden. So difficult for flats and things like that, especially as there's a freehold scenario, which is going to potentially prevent that from happening. But there's a lot of misinformation out there about heat pumps. So I'd say to people, do your research. Don't be put off by horror stories. There have been things like spray foam, for example, that have materially impacted people's mortgageability and their house value, sort of untried and tested technologies. So the heat pumps do work. They are efficient. They do save people money, especially if they're in concert with a system such as a solar array and a battery, which again can be part of the grant funded solutions, depending on where your EPC is, where you are in the country, and who your tenant is.
And is it possible to invest in this kind of, let's call it technology or improvements, and get some of that value back? Or you mentioned earlier that really without grants, you would be losing a lot of money. Are you still losing a little bit of money even with grants?
So the difficulty is the capture for the property owner. I see that. So if you're running HMOs and things like that, you're including the bills in the rent. So it's much easier for you to recapture the value. That needs to be considered. There are some pilot solar schemes running, Dunk, where the landlord can recapture the value because they can charge the tenant what the tenant would otherwise have paid through the electricity grid for micro generation. Now, you're probably looking at 7 to 8% returns for that stuff. So nothing that sets the world on fire. But if there was a way of leveraging, you know, when the government had the Green Deal, right, it was a great idea. The problem was the returns weren't coming from the Green Deal. So people would have to wait 28 years on the bills to get the money back. The theory was good, but the tech wasn't there. But the tech has moved on like it does.
Okay, so it can be possible. Brilliant, Adam, thanks. And I hope you won't need those blankets this winter. Right, it's now Person of the Week time, and we have this chap up behind me. There he is, got him. Who is Sir John Stanley. Now, Adam, honest question, did you know who Sir John Stanley was before I told you yesterday that he would be our Person of the Week?
Do you know what? I'm ashamed to say I absolutely didn't. And I really should have done. But I did then, of course, do my research.
Absolutely. So just quick intro for any of our other viewers who maybe don't know who Sir John Stanley was, who passed away last week. He was a politician. He was initially, I suppose, came to fame as the parliamentary private secretary of Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s when she was in opposition. When she formed a government, he took a range of ministerial posts. He was very popular with Mrs. Thatcher, and I think she trusted him. She often gave him tasks to kind of supervise or even watch over some of the ministers that maybe she didn't trust. He was in housing, he was in armed forces, he was in Northern Ireland. I read his obituary in the Telegraph, and it seemed he managed to make himself very unpopular with many of the people he worked with. Seems to have been an incredibly rude person, managing to offend, particularly, I think, soldiers who maybe are quite difficult to offend, I would have thought. But he proved to be a little bit unpopular, I would say, and redeemed himself rather as a backbencher when he was on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and was very heavily involved in questioning officials about the sexing up of the Iraq war dossier, and did, by all accounts, a very good job then. However, what he is known for in relation to this show is the right to buy scheme, which he did successfully push back on a lot of opposition, especially from Labour, but also from peers who were worried about this and worried about the unfairness it would cause between the private rental sector and the public rented sector, where tenants would have this automatic right to be able to buy their properties. So what's your verdict on his legacy in that regard, Adam?
Well, the greatest wealth transfer of all time from the state to the people, and relatively targeted, of course, at people who were at the time comparative serfs. It didn't look like the rental market today. A third of people or more were in state-owned housing, and it was a brilliant way to transfer wealth to them. It was a bit like a lottery ticket style system. The discounts ranged, 33 to 50%. The take up in the first few years of Right to Buy was about 350,000 homes very, very quickly in the early 1980s. And of course, you were luckier where you lived. There were people who won £1 million lottery tickets further down the line on properties they bought in London. So there was an element of luck, or a significant element of luck. The biggest problem was that it wasn't replicatable, because they didn't reinvest enough of the money, or force enough of the money to be reinvested into building more social housing. So we've got to fast forward to today, and we're a bit stuck, really. And that's why we've got such a big private rental sector, because the social sector was depleted. And one of the other things that upsets people is around about 40% of those units that have been bought under Right to Buy are now in the private rented sector. Some of them Angela Rayner style, where, she exercised her right to buy and now it's owned by a trust, and it caused all that fuss, and that is a rented property. Some was sold to private landlords. But the wealth transfer was there. But is it fair that it was in the early 80s that happened in perhaps our parents' generation, or even our grandparents' generation, depending on how long they've been there? You tell me. And of course, Right to Buy was so generous. All that's happened since 1980 is the scheme has been chipped and chipped and chipped and chipped away at. So the discounts aren't as big anymore, and all the rest of it. Still a good scheme for the, several thousand people that exercise it every year. But we went from 150,000 to about 7,500 people who exercised their right to buy last year. Done.
Yeah, I suppose I actually, and again, put up my hand for ignorance here, I wasn't aware that it was still operating, and there's still thousands of people each year who are buying their council properties. Okay, that's
right.
I'm going to pull you up, though, Adam, on your greatest wealth transfer ever, because you made this point, I think, a couple of weeks ago about not going back beyond 1940. But I would suggest that perhaps the redistribution of the monasteries after the Reformation may have been a bigger wealth transfer. But in the same way, transformational society, creating, in effect, almost a whole new class, almost this sort of lower middle class that got created as people crystallized some of the wealth that was in those properties that they were living in, and will, I think, have a genuine, historians will look back and say this is a genuine turning point, and I think already do, in the way that our societies work.
All I can say to that is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's all I have to say on the dissolution of the monasteries and the redistribution.
I think that's a great note on which to end, Adam. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We will be back next week hopefully around the same time. We'll see if we do it live or not. Let us know if you want us to, if it worked well live, or if you prefer us to do it recorded and put it out later. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Duncan.